We open with my favorite catchphrase, if I look exhausted, it's because I am exhausted. We just flew into Victoria, British Columbia, Canada from Detroit. I got a letter from a viewer asking me about the wildlife management approach to veganism, one of the ideas I've been talking about on this channel for years, and he was asking specifically about how my thoughts apply to hunting. We'll say why that is and what his interest was. When I searched my own channel, it's been more than 2 years since I said anything about hunting. So some of you may have been watching this channel for 2 years already and never heard me comment on hunting one way or another. I thought he asked a good question, and it's something other people might be confused about, especially given how long ago it was that I really kind of debated, discussed, explained, and did Q&A videos talking about these ideas. Many vegans are accustomed to criticizing the meat and dairy industry in terms of the profit motive. And I guess what makes this issue of the ethics of hunting different for the guy sending in the question is that the profit motive is removed and that there is a kind of ecological justification offered. In the United States of America, many people justify eating deer by claiming that the deer are too numerous, they're overpopulated, and therefore it's inevitable that the deer have to be killed anyway. And if it's inevitable that people have to kill the deer, then they argue, they say, why not eat the deer? Why not make a sport out of killing them? Why not even make a for-profit industry out of killing them? Why not make their skin into garments? So on and so forth. Now, probably you can already tell by the way I'm framing this question, I don't agree with any of those statements. It may be inevitable that you have to kill a thief, a robber, who comes through the window of your home and to try to burgle you, try to steal your belongings. Now, ideally, you might have a non-lethal way to tranquilize the thief, but let's say in these circumstances, you shoot and kill a thief. How many thieves are killed per year this way? It's inevitable. People are going to be shot for home invasions. What would that justify? What further steps ethically would be justified? Eating them, raping them, enslaving them, taking their skin and making it into an article of clothing? No, none of it. Absolutely none of it. Because the necessity of killing the thief in the home invasion, the necessity is only by sheer dint of self-defense. It's by those immediate circumstances, right? And if the necessity of killing deer or the necessity of killing rats or the necessity of killing wolves, if that really is a necessity created by ecology, then again, that justification is exhausted with the act of killing, and we have no justification for anything further. On the contrary, I'm quite comfortable in saying that it's evil to eat the deer that you've killed. And I think it's quite evil to make a sport, to make a game out of it. I think it would be evil to make a sport out of killing a human being who breaks into your house too, to make a game of it, well, if you're going to shoot this robber, if you're going to shoot this home invader, why not make a game of it? Why not make it fun? Why not invite your neighbor to come over for a thief hunting party? Why not try to make money out of it? Why not try to make his skin into leather? This is evil. Now, it's also true that we have questions of greater and lesser evil. But these things, I can make them more closely comparable. Here in Canada, it does happen that bears break into people's houses. I've said this before on the channel. Bears force their way through a window, often a basement window, and then they're in the person's basement and they found food or garbage and they're tearing it apart and can't get the bear back out. And it may be that you call animal control and the government is not going to help you and the police aren't going to help you. Or if the police do come to help you, they're just going to shoot the bear and kill it anyway. It may be that there is no simple matter of using a tranquilizer dart or, some kind of technique you may have imagined or seen in a Batman comic book to remove the bear without hurting it. It may indeed be inevitable, even if tragic, that human beings kill bears when those bears break into a human being's house. But even if the act of killing is justified, nothing further is justified, in my opinion. And I have to insist on this. If we kill rats in an apartment building for human convenience. Fundamentally, this is being done for human convenience. If we kill seagulls at an airport so that airplanes can take off and land on the runway without difficulty, that is fundamentally for human convenience. These are human values being imposed on animals. And I admit, whether we regard it as tragic or not, this is inevitable. It is absolutely inevitable that airports kill birds on and around runways. It's inevitable that we kill rats in big cities and different kinds of facilities. And the fact that it's inevitable doesn't mean it can't be reduced in number. There actually are really important steps we can take to reduce the number of rats living in cities. You can see that in Europe. I won't get into details, but you can see just even installing different kinds of spring-loaded plastic flaps over storm drains. It's amazing what a difference it can make. You can go from having millions of rats to having only a few thousand in a city by just trying to make drainage systems stop having hives of rats living in storm drains. There are things you can do, and that's very often the difference between a first world city and a third world city, are exactly those steps taken to reduce the number of rats and cockroaches living in sewage systems and such things that are created, again, for human convenience. But my third example here is that you have a forest being managed by human beings. It could be a national park, wildlife sanctuary, however you want to put it. The forest exists for the sake of the animals that are living in it. The forest exists for the sake of biodiversity, ecology, wildlife conservation. Nevertheless, if you make the decision that you have to kill some of the deer, or you have to kill, let's say, better example, human beings make the decision that they're going to kill some of the wolves, because if they don't kill the wolves are going to drive another species to extinction through predation or through crowding them out in the limited ecosystem. This example also is an example of killing animals for human convenience. Ultimately, there is no balance in nature. We have a human concept of balance in the ecosystem that we're trying to create and sustain. And we're choosing to create and sustain that through violence, the same way that we create and sustain a field of wheat on a wheat farm through constant violence against groundhogs and squirrels and other creatures that want to come in and burrow and dig tunnels and change the ecology in order to eat the food we're planting, or just to create their own habitat out of it instead, so on and so forth. So this is all fundamentally about acts of violence for human convenience. They are ultimately on the same level. Human beings need to eat bread, so we're going to grow wheat, and therefore it's inevitable that we're going to kill groundhogs. Just as I said before about rats, or even when I said about using tranquilizers on bears, I think there are steps we can take to reduce the number of groundhogs we're killing. And right now in Western society, nobody's taking that seriously. Nobody's taking seriously an ethical responsibility to try to reduce the number of mammals being killed to produce wheat. But we could. And there are steps we can use to reduce the number of rats we're killing. But I completely concede the point. The number is going to be greater than zero. But what I don't accept is the idea that you can make it into a sport, that you can make it into a game, you can make it into a food industry or a food product, or that you should enjoy eating that food. I think, or you can make the skin into a product, make a leather. No, I reject all of that, and I would reject it for human beings in the same situation. So the fellow who wrote into me, who does not support me on Patreon, please support the creation of new content on this channel for $1 a month on Patreon. I'll give a link below. He says that he is not an ecologist and cannot properly scrutinize the hunting as conservation arguments. I have a real simple reply to that. This is what I used to call a vegan mind trick. Hunting is not conservation. Conservation is conservation. Nothing else is conservation. Do you want to start a charity and do conservation? Is that what you want to do? Do you want to donate money for conservation? What do you want to do? You want to save the dolphins? You mean you want to restore a riverbank? What does conservation mean? Okay, and now what do you want to do? Oh, you want to take a vacation and catch salmon or shoot buck and kill them and mount their head on your wall. It's not conservation, is it? What does conservation science mean to you? What does a conservation charity do? What does the word conservation mean? I use a kind of aggressive Socratic method here of trying to get down to the real meaning of the terms. But no, nothing else is conservation. And I'm very practiced at having those kinds of arguments because when I worked in the humanitarian sector, a lot of the time you'd be talking about what do we really mean by humanitarian work, guys? What are we really talking about here? So he says, I agree with you that, unfortunately, at least some animals are going to have to die at our discretion, but I am not sure what a practical stance is to take on recreational hunting and laws pertaining to it. Should culling be restricted to wildlife management personnel and subsistence hunters only? So there's an interesting thing there. So he's alluding to, he does earlier in the text too, there's the issue of ecology, there's the issue of profit motive versus no profit motive. So the fact that unlike factory farming, this isn't being done for a profit, and at least hypothetically, you could be talking about indigenous tribal people who are doing this to survive, not for a profit in a cashless society. In theory, in reality, this is 2018, that's not what we're talking about. And he asks, would the deaths have more dignity if we sought to use the meat or remains of such animals whenever possible? In one stance, it can lead to the view of the animals as products, but in the other stance, we're wasting the animals. So that, I think, is the third point that I already have answered. So I already answered the guy in text form, and I'll just say, maybe last things first. The final point I make in my reply to him in text is, ultimately, it is racist, even if unintentionally racist, if you say that you would make excuses for an indigenous person eating meat or engaging in hunting that you wouldn't make for a white person, a black person, an Hispanic person, a Chinese person. And if you just think of yourself actually living in those circumstances, I used to know a lot of indigenous people, a lot of First Nations people when I was at First Nations University in Saskatchewan. If you actually know people who are Cree and Ojibwe and Mohawk, if you know them and you talk to them, and if you're not a racist asshole, if you're going to talk to them as equals, ultimately what you tell them about eating meat is going to be the same as what you tell a Chinese person or a black person or a white person. Why would you dumb it down or be dishonest or make moral excuses for them if you're talking to them as a friend? And if you care about them, it's the same as caring about a coworker or even a relative. You may have friends who are in that world and they're badly overweight, and you're saying, look, your health is falling apart. I hate to tell you this, but this traditional lifestyle you talk about, it's killing you, and here are the hard scientific facts. Of course you would say that. Of course, if you know someone and care about them. And most people watching this video have been through that scenario. And you may have been through that scenario with a black person and a white person and a Chinese person. So it's not any different if they're of some other ethnicity. Now that's, of course, the example I just used was of addressing it in terms of the health element. I can say the same again about addressing the ecology. The ecology argument is exactly the same. Doesn't matter if I'm talking to a black person, a white person, or a Chinese person, etc., or an indigenous person. If I'm going to discuss ecology with them, I'm not going to lie to them because of their ethnicity. That also would be evil. And finally, the ethical argument. I don't believe ethics are different for black people and white people because I'm not racist. If anyone really believed that, thought there was a different ethical system for different races, it would be a very bizarre and overt form of racism. I think the majority of people who really are racist, it's never even occurred to them to think in those terms. So I answered him as follows. I'll read this a little bit quickly. Totally reasonable question. Number one, I am not pro-hunting. However, number two, I am willing to admit, whereas some vegans are not, that when you compare hunting to factory farming, it is the lesser of two evils. But 3, the lesser of two evils is still evil. Interestingly, 4, I would not, repeat not, regard it as ethical to eat an animal that was doomed to be killed by human needs anyway. For example, if you need to kill seagulls to make it safe for airplanes to land at an airport, I do not think you should proceed to make a food product out of the seagulls. Now explain this in this video. However, 5, my position in just admitting point number 2, that there is a meaningful difference between an animal living its whole life in the wild, living in a pack, exploring in the forest, in the jungle, whatever the case may be, living its whole life in the wild, even if in the end it is shot dead, as opposed to living in captivity in a factory farm, on a concrete floor, under a steel sky, surrounded by fences, etc., etc. The fact that I am willing to admit this is still a significant source of debate amongst vegans. Some vegans regard hunting as more evil or as more sinful. I'm using sinful in a jesting manner here. Some regard hunting as more sinful than the passive consumption of factory farmed meat. And this is similar to Hindu and Buddhist attitudes. In many of those religions, they think of doing something intentionally and knowingly as a worse crime or as a worse sin than just participating in it through ignorance and passively. On an aesthetic level, I really feel the other way about it. I find it less repugnant that a hunter kills and butchers a wild animal, himself or herself. I find that less repugnant than the millions of people I see around me who are kidding themselves that factory farm meat is, necessary and normal as part of their daily lives, and who are very often in a deep state of denial and cognitive dissonance as to how that animal died and what it really means to slit an animal's throat and tear the pieces of its body apart for food. But this is into the realm of aesthetics and not ethics and not science. Some vegans regard vivisection as the ultimate sin, etc. So that is also an interesting thing. If you just think about the pyramid of priorities, what vegans think of as the objective of their activism, what they think of as their enemy or their hurdles, the obstacles they're going to overcome, you can actually define some different sub-movements within veganism by thinking about this a little bit. And then point 6, as I've already stated, was that I do say that it is ultimately, even if unintentionally racist, to make excuses for indigenous peoples eating meat, to talk to them really in any other way than how you'd talk to a white person, an Hispanic person, a Chinese person, or what have you. So what is the point? Why do we have multiple competing approaches to veganism? Well, Gary Francione created what was called the abolitionist approach to try to address and overcome absurdities, real absurdities that arose from the approach that existed before him, which he likes to call the welfarist approach. And it's true. The welfarist approach to veganism, it has some advantages. It also has some disadvantages. And in certain contexts, those disadvantages start to look ridiculous. Now, by the same token, a very simple principle. The principle that some people would say this, I do not say this, some people would say veganism means never killing any animals. Some people would say regarding animals as all having a soul and a moral worth equal to a human being and never killing any animals. Well, that leads to some absurdities, such as we've already talked about, killing rats to prevent infestation, killing seagulls, especially right at an airport or where they're blocking a radar array, killing cockroaches just so that you don't have a kitchen infested with cockroaches. All these issues down the line. A very simple principle, if carried out in a thoroughgoing and consistent way, can lead to absurdities of this kind. And the wildlife management paradigm, wildlife management approach to veganism, in contrast to the abolitionist approach, in contrast to the welfarist approach, it starts by saying, look, utilitarianism leads to certain absurdities. And this is a segue. My recent videos have talked about unnatural vegan or utilitarian approach. utilitarians would really claim that there's nothing wrong with wearing secondhand leather because it quote-unquote doesn't do any harm or the harm is already done. Utilitarians would claim that there's nothing wrong with eating meat if you're going to kill the rats anyway, if you're going to kill the seagulls anyway, so on and so forth. If you've already killed a bear that broke into your house, you might as well eat it. This is one example, not the only one of the type of absurdity that utilitarianism gets into. But very broadly speaking, almost every approach in veganism, I can think of one exception, almost every approach at the time I got involved in veganism, when I really started talking about it and thinking about it and reading about it, trying to organize activism, almost every approach was fixated on the idea of a pet dog on the carpet as the moral baseline. And Unnatural Vegan, Swayze, she's a great example of this. Her standard for how all animals must be treated, ought to be treated, her standard for what's normal and for what every animal deserves is that every animal deserves to be treated, she says, like a dog lying on the carpet watching TV. And I say the exact opposite. I think that to take a wolf and chop its testicles off, literally, castrate it, train it, break its will, destroy its independence, cut it off from its own species, never allow it to live in a pack, never allow it to explore the wilderness, to take a wolf and turn it into a human toy, to turn it into a plaything for our amusement, for our diversion, for our quote-unquote emotional needs. I don't think we have those emotional needs. I think that's just as ridiculous as saying that you need cocaine for your emotional needs. There are a lot of things people think they need, you don't really need. You don't need a dog to watch television with you. You don't. And that dog doesn't need you to enslave it so it can lie there like a living carpet while you watch television. It's sick. Broadly speaking, every approach to veganism, including Gary Francione's abolitionist approach, they had settled in on this idea of pet ownership, caring for and coddling pets as their moral baseline. And I rejected that and said, no, we got to get back to the wilderness. We've got to look at animals living independent, dignified lives in the wild, which includes a dignified death. We've got to look at that as the baseline from which we derive our ethical and political principles. There's a whole playlist of videos if you want to hear more, but you may not need to hear more. This video may have told you everything you need to know. Now let's roll up our sleeves and save the planet. Pay $1 a month to support me on Patreon, or don't. Send me email. Get in touch with me however you want to get in touch with me. I'm going through a really difficult transition in my life. I don't know where I'm going to be living 6 months from now. I'd say I'm running my fingers through my hair, but I don't have any hair to run my fingers through. I'm really, turning the phone book upside down and going through all different options, A through Z, to figure out what I'm doing with my life. Because my plans for my career, for how I was going to pay my rent, and for how I was going to pursue vegan activism, they all hinged on going to culinary school, then ultimately opening up a bakery. And within the last month, that all fell apart. I'm having to make whole new plans. So guys, I've had a lot of initiative. I've tried to start quite a few different projects going in vegan activism in the last 4 years. And you know what? I haven't heard from any of you. I don't hear from anyone in my audience inviting me to participate in something you've started. Whether that's, something as humble as giving a lecture at a Veg Fest or participating or joining something you do. But guys, I'm only a leader because I don't have the luxury of being a follower. By all means, get in touch with me, whether or not you donate to the channel, and let's start living our lives as if we really were trying to save the planet.